File Edit. Chapter 1.txt, adding more content to Chapter 1 to reach the 10,500 character target while maintaining narrative flow. Old content. What Richard didn't know was that Maria had been counting on exactly that assumption. New content. What Richard didn't know was that Maria had been counting on exactly that assumption. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember the conversation she had overheard just 2 weeks ago. Richard had been in his study, doors slightly ajar, talking to Patricia Thornfield on speakerphone about their strategy for today's hearing. Maria had been walking past with laundry when she heard her own name mentioned, followed by laughter. The key to winning this case, Patricia had said in her clipped professional tone, is establishing that your wife simply lacks the sophistication to understand complex financial arrangements. We'll present her as well-meaning but ultimately naive about business matters. Her limited English skills work in our favor here. If we can show the judge that she couldn't possibly have contributed meaningfully to building your wealth, the settlement becomes much more straightforward. Richard had chuckled, a sound Maria had once found charming but now recognized as deeply cruel. She barely asks questions about the business anyway, he had replied. Half the time I don't think she understands what I do for a living. You should see her face when I try to explain investment strategies or market analysis. It's like talking to a confused child. Maria had stood frozen in the hallway, arms full of Richard's freshly pressed shirts, listening to her husband of 12 years reduce her to a caricature for legal advantage. The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia outlining how they would use Maria's background against her, how they would frame her contributions to the marriage as purely domestic, how they would suggest that awarding her significant assets would be essentially giving money to someone incapable of managing it responsibly. That night, Maria had sat at her kitchen table until 3 in the morning, reviewing every document in her hidden files, cross-referencing dates and amounts, checking her notes against bank records and business filings. She had spent the years of her marriage being careful, being thorough, being invisible. But invisible, she had learned, also meant unnoticed. And unnoticed people could observe and document things that others assumed they were too simple to understand. The courthouse began to fill with the morning's docket of cases. Maria watched lawyers stride past with their briefcases and confident expressions, watched families huddle together before custody hearings, watched other women like herself sitting alone and trying to look brave. The familiar ache of isolation settled in her chest, the same feeling she had carried throughout her marriage whenever Richard's world made her feel like an outsider looking in. But today felt different. Today, the isolation felt less like weakness and more like camouflage. A young clerk appeared in the hallway calling out case numbers. Maria heard her own name paired with Richard's, followed by instructions to proceed into courtroom 4B. She gathered her purse, stood slowly, and walked toward the heavy wooden doors that would determine the next chapter of her life. Behind those doors waited Richard and his team, confident in their strategy and certain of their victory. They had every reason to feel secure. The law favored people like Richard, people who spoke the right language and knew the right people and understood how to work the system to their advantage. What they hadn't counted on was the possibility that Maria had been working the system too, just from a different angle, with different tools, and with a patience that came from having nothing left to lose. The courtroom felt larger than Maria remembered from their brief pretrial conference. High ceilings stretched above polished wooden benches, and afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Judge Harrison Blackwood presided from his elevated bench, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his expression suggesting a man who had heard every possible variation of marital discord over his 25 years on the family court bench. Maria took her seat beside her attorney, Linda Rodriguez, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who specialized in representing women in difficult divorce cases. Linda had come recommended by the Women's Legal Aid Clinic where Maria had first sought advice, and while she was competent and thorough, her client load was heavy and her resources limited compared to the legal powerhouse sitting across the aisle. Richard's side of the courtroom looked like a war room. Patricia Thornfield sat at the center of a mahogany table covered with perfectly organized files, flanked by 2 junior associates who moved with the efficient precision of expensive legal machinery. Behind them, Richard's family had assembled in force. His mother Eleanor sat rigid in the front row, her designer handbag positioned precisely on her lap, and her silver hair arranged in the same style she had worn for the past decade. Beside her sat his sister Diane and her husband Marcus, both wearing expressions of carefully controlled disgust as they periodically glanced in Maria's direction. Judge Blackwood called the proceedings to order, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. The case before them involved the dissolution of marriage between Richard Michael Castellanos and Maria Elena Gonzalez, with particular focus on the division of assets accumulated during their 12-year union. The judge's preliminary review of the filed documents suggested a straightforward case of contested property division, though he noted some complexity regarding business assets and their valuation. Patricia Thornfield rose to present her opening statement with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case she expected to win. She painted a picture of Richard as a self-made entrepreneur who had built his construction and development company through decades of hard work, strategic thinking, and business acumen. Her voice carried just the right note of respectful formality as she outlined his contributions to the marriage, emphasizing his role as sole breadwinner and financial decision-maker. When she turned to address Maria's role in the marriage, Patricia's tone shifted subtly. She spoke of a woman who had been provided with a comfortable lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved independently, someone who had benefited enormously from her husband's success while contributing little to its creation. The words were carefully chosen to avoid overt prejudice, while still conveying the underlying message that Maria had been a passenger rather than a partner in building their shared wealth. Maria watched Judge Blackwood's face as Patricia spoke, noting the slight nods and interested expressions that suggested the narrative was landing as intended. The judge occasionally made notes on his legal pad, and Maria found herself wondering what assumptions he was forming about her based on Patricia's carefully crafted presentation. When Patricia finished her opening remarks, Linda Rodriguez stood to present Maria's case. Her statement was more modest in scope, focusing on Maria's domestic contributions and her right to fair consideration in the asset division. Linda emphasized Maria's loyalty and support throughout Richard's business development, her management of their household, and her entitlement to security after 12 years of marriage. But even to Maria's ears, the argument sounded defensive and somewhat apologetic, as if Linda were asking for charity rather than demanding justice. The first phase of testimony focused on establishing the timeline and value of assets acquired during the marriage. Richard took the witness stand with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He wore a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for court appearances, and his responses to Patricia's questions were polished and authoritative. Richard described the growth of his business empire with obvious pride, detailing complex real estate transactions, development projects, and investment strategies that had multiplied their wealth over the years. He spoke fluently about market analysis, zoning regulations, construction logistics, and financial planning, using terminology that demonstrated his expertise while simultaneously emphasizing the sophisticated knowledge required to navigate his business world. When Patricia asked about Maria's involvement in business decisions, Richard's expression took on a tone of patient condescension. He explained that while Maria had always been supportive of his work, she had shown little interest in or aptitude for understanding the complexities involved. He described attempts to include her in business discussions that had ended with her looking confused or overwhelmed, shaking her head, and saying she trusted him to handle such matters. The picture Richard painted was of a marriage where he had shouldered all financial responsibility while Maria had focused on domestic concerns. He spoke of her struggles with English in business contexts, her tendency to defer to his judgment on important decisions, and her general preference for simple, straightforward explanations rather than detailed analysis. His voice carried just enough affection to avoid sounding completely dismissive, but the underlying message was clear. Maria lacked the sophistication to be a true partner in building their success. During cross-examination, Linda Rodriguez attempted to challenge Richard's characterization of Maria's contributions. She asked about household management, social entertaining for business purposes, and emotional support during difficult periods. Richard acknowledged these contributions with polite appreciation, but his responses consistently emphasized their domestic rather than business nature. When Linda pressed him about specific instances where Maria had offered business input, Richard smiled indulgently and described well-meaning suggestions that missed the mark due to her limited understanding of market forces and industry dynamics. The most damaging moment came when Linda asked whether Maria had ever expressed interest in learning more about the business. Richard paused thoughtfully before answering that he had occasionally tried to explain various projects to her, but that the complexity had seemed to frustrate rather than engage her. He described her body language during these conversations, the way her eyes would glaze over when he discussed financial projections or regulatory requirements, how she would eventually interrupt to ask about dinner plans or household matters. Judge Blackwood asked several clarifying questions about the business structure and asset valuation, questions that Richard answered with impressive detail and obvious expertise. The judge seemed particularly interested in a recent commercial development project that had significantly increased their net worth, and Richard's explanation of the zoning challenges and construction logistics clearly impressed the court. During a brief recess, Maria overheard conversations from Richard's family that made her stomach clench with familiar pain. Eleanor Castellanos was speaking quietly to Diane about how sad it was that Richard had to go through this ordeal, how unfortunate it was that he had to defend his hard work against someone who had never truly understood or appreciated his achievements. Diane nodded sympathetically and added that perhaps it was for the best that Richard would finally be free to find someone who could be a real partner in his success. The comments grew more pointed as the family members seemed to forget that Maria was within earshot. Marcus wondered aloud whether Maria would even be able to manage whatever settlement she received, given her apparent lack of financial sophistication. Eleanor suggested that perhaps the kindest outcome would be a modest allowance that would allow Maria to return to her family in Colombia, where she might be happier among people who shared her background and limitations. Linda Rodriguez noticed Maria's distress and guided her to a quiet corner of the hallway during the recess. She acknowledged that the morning had been difficult, but reminded Maria that they would have their opportunity to present their case. Linda reviewed the documents they planned to submit, including bank records showing joint account activity and household expenses that Maria had managed independently. But even Linda's reassurances carried an undertone of concern, as if she were beginning to worry that their preparation might not be sufficient to counter the narrative being constructed by the opposition. When court resumed, Patricia Thornfield called additional witnesses to support Richard's version of events. His business partner testified about Richard's leadership and strategic vision, describing him as the driving force behind their company's success. The company's accountant provided detailed testimony about the complexity of their financial structure, emphasizing the specialized knowledge required to understand and manage their various investments and holdings. Each witness painted the same picture: Richard as a sophisticated businessman operating in complex markets that required expertise and experience to navigate successfully. The cumulative effect was to establish not just his competence, but the specialized nature of the knowledge and skills involved in creating their wealth. By implication, anyone lacking this expertise would have been unable to contribute meaningfully to the business success that had generated their marital assets. Throughout these proceedings, Maria sat quietly beside Linda Rodriguez, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook that she kept in her purse. To observers, she appeared to be struggling to follow the technical testimony, occasionally looking confused by financial terminology or business concepts. Her body language suggested someone who was out of her depth, overwhelmed by the complexity of the legal and financial discussions swirling around her. But Maria was listening to everything with intense focus, and her notes were far more detailed than anyone realized. She was documenting not just the testimony but the contradictions, the omissions, and the carefully constructed half-truths that Richard and his witnesses were presenting. Her notebook contained cross-references to documents and dates that painted a very different picture of her involvement in their financial affairs. As the afternoon wore on, Maria opened her purse to retrieve a tissue and caught sight of the manila envelope she kept hidden beneath her wallet. Inside that envelope were documents that would transform this entire proceeding, credentials and certificates that revealed a completely different story about her background and capabilities. But for now, those documents remained hidden, as Maria continued to play the role that everyone expected her to play. The day's testimony concluded with Judge Blackwood scheduling additional hearings to complete the evidence presentation. As the courtroom began to empty, Richard's confidence was palpable. He shook hands warmly with his legal team and accepted congratulations from his family members, clearly satisfied with how the proceedings had unfolded. Maria gathered her simple purse and followed Linda Rodriguez toward the exit, still maintaining the appearance of someone who had been overwhelmed by the day's events. But behind her carefully composed expression, she was calculating timing and strategy, preparing for the moment when she would reveal exactly who she really was and what she actually knew. File edit. Chapter 3.txt shortening the linguistics expert testimony section to reduce character count. Old content. When proceedings resumed, Patricia called her most damaging witness, Dr. Sarah Fleming, a linguistics professor who had been retained to provide expert testimony about language barriers and their impact on comprehension of complex technical material. Dr. Fleming was a distinguished woman in her 60s whose credentials included decades of research into second language acquisition and the challenges faced by non-native speakers in professional environments. Dr. Fleming's testimony was clinically precise as she described the cognitive load involved in processing complex information in a second language, particularly when technical terminology and abstract concepts were involved. She explained how even highly intelligent individuals could appear confused or disengaged when forced to process sophisticated material in a language they had not mastered to an academic level, and how this could create the impression of intellectual limitation rather than linguistic challenge. The professor's analysis included specific examples of how non-native speakers might struggle with legal and financial terminology, how they might avoid participating in discussions where they felt linguistically disadvantaged, and how their silence or apparent confusion could be misinterpreted as lack of understanding or interest rather than difficulty with language processing. Patricia asked Dr. Fleming to review transcripts of several depositions where Maria had given brief, simple answers to complex questions about business matters. The professor noted the basic sentence structures, limited vocabulary, and tendency toward short responses, all of which she characterized as typical patterns for someone operating at an intermediate level of English proficiency who felt overwhelmed by technical subject matter. Linda Rodriguez attempted to challenge this testimony by pointing out that language ability could vary significantly depending on context and stress levels, but Dr. Fleming acknowledged this while maintaining that the patterns shown in Maria's responses suggested fundamental limitations in technical language comprehension that would have made meaningful participation in complex business discussions extremely difficult. New content. When proceedings resumed, Patricia called Dr. Sarah Fleming, a linguistics professor retained to provide expert testimony about language barriers. Dr. Fleming's credentials included decades of research into second language acquisition and challenges faced by non-native speakers in professional environments. Dr. Fleming testified about the cognitive load involved in processing complex information in a second language, particularly with technical terminology. She explained how intelligent individuals could appear confused when forced to process sophisticated material in a non-native language, creating impressions of intellectual limitation rather than linguistic challenge. Patricia asked Dr. Fleming to review transcripts where Maria had given brief answers to complex business questions. The professor noted basic sentence structures and limited vocabulary, characterizing these as typical patterns for someone with intermediate English proficiency who felt overwhelmed by technical subject matter. Maria stood in complete silence for a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, her eyes moving slowly from Richard's face to Judge Blackwood's concerned expression, then to Patricia Thornfield's increasingly worried features. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the hesitation or uncertainty that had characterized her previous responses. Instead, her words emerged with crystalline clarity and perfect pronunciation, each syllable delivered with the precision of someone completely comfortable with the English language at its most sophisticated level. "Your Honor," Maria began, her accent almost entirely absent, "I appreciate your concern about my need for translation services, but I can assure you that will not be necessary. I have been following every word of these proceedings with complete comprehension, including the rather sophisticated legal arguments presented by opposing counsel and the complex financial testimony offered by their expert witnesses." The transformation was so dramatic that several people in the courtroom audibly gasped. Richard's mouth fell open as he stared at his wife of 12 years. Hearing her speak with an eloquence and authority he had never witnessed before. The woman who had stumbled over basic financial terms just minutes earlier was now using complex legal terminology with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying jurisprudence. Judge Blackwood leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from protective concern to intense curiosity. The change in Maria's demeanor was so complete that it seemed as if an entirely different person had taken her place. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her hands were no longer nervously fidgeting with her purse, and her eyes held a confidence that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. Maria continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. I must confess to this court that I have allowed a significant misrepresentation to persist throughout these proceedings. The characterization of my educational background and professional qualifications that has been presented by my husband and his legal team is not merely incomplete, but fundamentally false. She reached into her purse and withdrew the manila envelope that had remained hidden throughout the previous day and a half of testimony. From it, she extracted a series of documents that she placed carefully on the table before her. The papers were official university transcripts, professional certifications, and academic credentials, all bearing official seals and signatures that immediately caught Judge Blackwood's attention. Your Honor, Maria said as she organized the documents with practiced efficiency, I hold a doctorate in comparative linguistics from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, with specialized focus on legal terminology across Romance and Germanic language families. I also possess a Master of Laws degree in International Commercial Law from the same institution, where I served as a professor of applied linguistics for 8 years before immigrating to the United States. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Patricia Thornfield looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her carefully prepared case beginning to crumble before her eyes. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his brain struggling to process information that contradicted everything he believed he knew about the woman he had lived with for over a decade. Maria lifted the first document from her collection, a diploma written in Spanish with official university seals clearly visible. My doctoral dissertation, she explained with academic precision, focused specifically on the challenges faced by legal translators when working with complex commercial contracts across multiple jurisdictions. The research required fluency in 7 languages and deep understanding of legal frameworks in 12 different countries. She placed the diploma carefully on the table and reached for the next document. This is my certification from the Colombian Ministry of Education authorizing me to teach graduate-level courses in comparative linguistics and legal translation. During my tenure at the university, I supervised over 40 thesis projects and published extensively on the subject of cross-cultural legal communication. Judge Blackwood asked to examine the documents, and Maria handed them over with the calm confidence of someone whose credentials could withstand any scrutiny. The judge studied each paper carefully, noting the official seals, signatures, and detailed academic records that documented years of advanced education and professional achievement. Maria turned to face Richard directly, her expression calm but unmistakably authoritative. My husband has spent 12 years believing that I struggled to understand his business discussions because I lacked the intellectual capacity to follow complex topics. The truth is quite different. I chose to remain silent during those conversations because I realized very early in our marriage that my educational background and professional expertise intimidated him. Her voice carried no anger, only the steady authority of someone stating facts that could be easily verified. When we were first married, I attempted to participate in his business conversations using my full vocabulary and knowledge base. Richard's reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. He became defensive and dismissive when I offered insights based on my background in international commercial law or when I corrected his understanding of regulatory frameworks in other countries. Maria reached for another document from her collection, this one bearing the seal of the International Chamber of Commerce. This certificate authorizes me to serve as an expert witness in international commercial disputes, specifically in cases involving cross-border contract interpretation and translation accuracy. I have maintained this certification throughout our marriage, completing required continuing education through online courses that Richard assumed were English language tutorials. The revelation continued with methodical precision that demonstrated exactly the kind of organized thinking Patricia Thornfield had argued Maria lacked. "I speak 7 languages fluently," Maria explained, including legal Latin, which I noticed was quoted incorrectly in several of the documents presented by opposing counsel yesterday. "My language skills include Spanish and English, obviously, but also Portuguese, French, Italian, German, and enough Mandarin Chinese to handle basic commercial negotiations." Patricia Thornfield finally found her voice, objecting that this information should have been disclosed during discovery. Judge Blackwood noted the objection but indicated that the court was interested in understanding why such significant educational and professional background had not been presented earlier in the proceedings. Maria's response was delivered with devastating clarity. "Your Honor, I deliberately concealed my qualifications because my husband made it clear throughout our marriage that he was threatened by women who possessed expertise in areas he considered his domain. Early in our relationship, when I attempted to contribute meaningfully to business discussions or offered insights based on my legal background, Richard would become hostile and accusatory, suggesting that I was trying to make him look foolish or incompetent." She gestured toward the stack of expert testimony that had been presented over the past 2 days. The witnesses who testified about the complexity of financial instruments and international business law were describing concepts that are fundamental components of my doctoral education. I have spent years studying exactly the kinds of cross-border commercial transactions and regulatory compliance issues that supposedly require such specialized knowledge to understand. Richard attempted to interrupt, but Judge Blackwood firmly instructed him to remain silent while Maria continued her testimony. The judge's expression suggested someone who was beginning to understand that the entire foundation of the case presented by Richard's legal team had been built on false assumptions. Maria reached for her final document, a leather-bound portfolio that contained her published academic work. "These are articles I have published in international law journals over the past 15 years, including 3 papers specifically addressing the legal frameworks governing commercial real estate development in cross-border transactions. I am quite familiar with the zoning regulations, environmental compliance requirements, and investment structures that my husband described in his testimony, because these topics fall directly within my area of professional expertise." The portfolio contained copies of academic articles with Maria's name clearly listed as the primary author, published in respected journals with international circulation. The topics covered exactly the areas of law and business that Richard had claimed were too complex for Maria to understand, and the publication dates showed that her expertise predated many of his own business ventures. Maria's voice remained steady and professional as she delivered her final revelation. "Throughout our marriage, I have deliberately simplified my speech patterns and avoided using technical terminology in order to preserve my husband's sense of intellectual superiority. I spoke carefully and slowly not because English is difficult for me, but because I learned that Richard was more comfortable when he could maintain the illusion that he was the more educated and sophisticated partner in our relationship." The courtroom remained in stunned silence as the full implications of Maria's revelations settled over everyone present. Richard sat pale and motionless, his entire worldview shattered by discoveries that revealed 12 years of marriage built on fundamentally false assumptions. His legal team looked equally devastated, realizing that their entire strategy had been based on completely inaccurate information about their opponent's capabilities and background. Judge Blackwood studied the documents spread before him, his expression reflecting a growing understanding of just how dramatically the dynamics of this case had shifted in the space of a few minutes. Maria organized her documents with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Her transformation from confused immigrant to commanding legal expert was so complete that even Linda Rodriguez stared at her client in amazement, suddenly understanding that the woman she had been representing possessed qualifications that exceeded her own. "Your Honor," Maria continued with unwavering confidence, "I would like to address several significant inaccuracies in the testimony that has been presented regarding our marital assets and their acquisition. My husband and his legal team have constructed their case on the assumption that I was unaware of the details surrounding our financial holdings, but I must inform this court that I have been documenting and analyzing every transaction for the past 8 years. She reached into her purse and withdrew a second folder, this one containing bank records, investment statements, and business documents that had been organized with academic thoroughness. Each page was labeled with tabs written in multiple languages, and the margins contained detailed notes in handwriting so precise it resembled typography. Maria lifted the first document from this collection, a bank statement showing international wire transfers that Richard had described as routine business transactions. She began speaking in rapid Spanish, translating the document aloud before switching seamlessly to English to explain its significance. This transfer, dated March 15th of last year, was described in my husband's testimony as payment for construction materials. However, the receiving account belongs to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands that has no legitimate business operations. Judge Blackwood leaned forward with intense interest as Maria continued her analysis. She switched to Portuguese to read the original documentation from the receiving bank, then back to English to explain how the transaction violated federal reporting requirements for international money transfers. Her fluency in multiple languages allowed her to trace financial movements across borders in real time, demonstrating exactly the kind of sophisticated analysis that Richard's experts had claimed was beyond her capabilities. Patricia Thornfield attempted to object to the introduction of new evidence, but Maria responded by citing specific federal rules of civil procedure that allowed for the presentation of rebuttal evidence when opposing testimony contained material misrepresentations. Her legal citations were precise and accurate, delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent years teaching such concepts to graduate students. Maria turned to face Richard directly, her expression calm but unmistakably authoritative. My husband has testified that I showed little interest in or understanding of his business operations. I would like to clarify that my apparent disengagement was actually careful observation and documentation. Because Richard assumed I could not comprehend technical discussions, he conducted sensitive business conversations in my presence without realizing that I was recording and analyzing every word. From her folder, she produced a small digital recording device and a stack of printed transcripts. With the court's permission, she began playing audio recordings of conversations between Richard and his business associates, conversations that had taken place in their home while Maria was supposedly occupied with domestic tasks. The recordings captured Richard discussing tax evasion strategies, fraudulent property valuations, and deliberate misrepresentation of asset ownership for divorce planning purposes. The first recording was a phone conversation between Richard and his accountant from 6 months ago, where they discussed moving assets to offshore accounts to hide them from potential divorce proceedings. Richard's voice was clearly audible as he expressed concern about Maria discovering their financial manipulations, though he dismissed this possibility by noting that she barely understood basic banking concepts anyway. Maria paused the recording and provided simultaneous translation of several technical terms that Richard had used incorrectly, demonstrating not only her linguistic skills, but also her superior understanding of the financial instruments he was attempting to manipulate. She noted specific errors in his description of investment vehicles and corrected his misstatements about international banking regulations. The second recording captured a conversation between Richard and Patricia Thornfield herself, recorded during a meeting in Richard's home office while Maria was supposedly cleaning nearby. In this conversation, Patricia explicitly outlined their strategy of portraying Maria as intellectually limited and financially naive, discussing how they could exploit cultural stereotypes to influence the judge's perception of her capabilities. Judge Blackwood's expression grew increasingly stern as he listened to the strategic planning that had gone into undermining Maria's credibility. The recording captured Patricia advising Richard to emphasize Maria's accent and language difficulties, suggesting that they could create doubt about her ability to understand complex financial matters by highlighting her immigrant background. Maria stopped the recording and addressed the court with scholarly precision. "Your Honor, I believe this conversation demonstrates that opposing counsel has deliberately constructed a case based on ethnic and educational prejudice rather than factual analysis of my contributions to our marital assets. As someone who has spent years studying the legal frameworks governing such discrimination, I can cite numerous precedents where such tactics have resulted in sanctions against the attorneys involved. She proceeded to cite 3 specific court cases where lawyers had faced professional discipline for exploiting cultural biases in family law proceedings. Her citations included exact case numbers, jurisdictions, and relevant precedential language, delivered from memory with the fluency of someone who had taught these concepts for years. Linda Rodriguez finally found her voice, asking Maria why she had not shared this information earlier in their case preparation. Maria's response revealed the full extent of her strategic planning. I needed to allow opposing counsel to fully commit to their prejudicial strategy before revealing the evidence that would destroy it. If I had disclosed my qualifications and evidence earlier, they would have simply adjusted their approach. By allowing them to build their entire case on false assumptions, I ensured that their position would be completely indefensible once the truth emerged. Maria returned to her financial evidence, producing bank records that showed her name on accounts Richard had claimed belonged entirely to his business. She had copies of signature cards, loan applications, and investment documents that clearly identified her as a co-owner of assets Richard had attempted to characterize as his separate property. Her analysis included cross-references between account numbers and tax filings that exposed multiple instances of misrepresentation. Most damaging of all were the business formation documents that showed Maria's name as a founding partner in several of Richard's companies, with signatures dating back to the early years of their marriage. She explained that Richard had asked her to sign various papers over the years, always dismissing her questions by claiming they were routine documents that she wouldn't understand anyway. Maria had signed everything, but had also kept copies, maintaining detailed records of every legal document that bore her signature. She produced incorporation papers for 3 different companies where she was listed as a 50% owner, loan guarantees where she had pledged personal assets as collateral, and partnership agreements that clearly established her legal rights to business profits. Each document was authentic, properly notarized, and legally binding, creating an undeniable paper trail of her involvement in building their shared wealth. Maria's presentation included expert analysis of commercial real estate transactions where her signature appeared on purchase agreements, development contracts, and zoning applications. She demonstrated detailed knowledge of the legal requirements for each type of transaction, citing specific regulations and compliance standards that proved her active participation in the business decisions Richard had claimed she was incapable of understanding. The most devastating revelation came when Maria produced correspondence between herself and various government agencies, all written in her name and addressing complex regulatory issues related to Richard's business operations. The letters were written in sophisticated legal language and demonstrated deep understanding of environmental regulations, zoning requirements, and international trade law. Judge Blackwood studied each document carefully as Maria presented them, his expression reflecting growing amazement at the thoroughness of her preparation and the depth of her legal knowledge. It became clear that far from being a confused bystander in her own marriage, Maria had been an active and highly qualified partner whose contributions had been systematically concealed and misrepresented. Richard sat in stunned silence throughout this presentation, his face growing paler with each revelation. His legal team scrambled to respond to evidence they had never anticipated, realizing that their entire strategy had been built on fundamentally false premises. Patricia Thornfield looked increasingly desperate as she watched 12 years of careful case preparation crumble in the face of superior documentation and legal expertise. Maria's final piece of evidence was a detailed financial analysis she had prepared using her background in international commercial law. The document traced the growth of their marital assets through complex investment strategies, identifying specific contributions she had made through her legal expertise and business analysis. Her work had directly generated millions of dollars in additional value through proper structuring of international transactions and regulatory compliance strategies. When Maria finished her presentation, the courtroom remained in absolute silence. She had systematically demolished every aspect of Richard's case, while simultaneously demonstrating legal and financial expertise that exceeded that of the expensive attorneys he had hired to represent him. Judge Blackwood sat in contemplative silence for several long minutes after Maria finished her presentation, studying the overwhelming evidence spread across his bench. The transformation of the proceedings from a routine property dispute into a revelation of systematic deception and prejudice had clearly affected him deeply. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of judicial authority backed by genuine moral indignation. "Mrs. Gonzalez," the judge began, his tone reflecting both respect and amazement. "In 35 years of presiding over family court proceedings, I have never witnessed such a comprehensive demonstration of legal preparation and professional expertise from a litigant. Your presentation has not only established your qualifications and contributions to the marital estate, but has also revealed deeply troubling patterns of deception and discrimination that this court cannot ignore." Judge Blackwood turned his attention to Richard, whose face had gone ashen as the full implications of his situation became clear. "Mr. Castellanos," the judge continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "your testimony to this court has been revealed as fundamentally dishonest. You have systematically misrepresented your wife's capabilities, her contributions to your business success, and her legal status as a partner in multiple commercial enterprises. More seriously, you have attempted to exploit ethnic and educational prejudices to gain unfair advantage in these proceedings." The judge's rebuke continued with methodical precision that echoed Maria's own presentation style. "Your characterization of Mrs. Gonzalez as someone lacking the sophistication to understand complex business matters has been exposed as not merely incorrect, but deliberately false. The evidence clearly demonstrates that she possesses superior qualifications in precisely the areas where you claimed expertise, and that her contributions to your business success were both substantial and ongoing." Richard attempted to speak, but Judge Blackwood silenced him with a firm gesture. "The recordings presented by Mrs. Gonzalez reveal that you were not only aware of her qualifications, but actively worked to suppress and conceal them because they threatened your sense of superiority. Your comments about her intelligence and capabilities represent a pattern of psychological manipulation that this court finds deeply disturbing." The judge turned his attention to Patricia Thornfield, whose professional composure had completely dissolved during Maria's evidence presentation. "Ms. Thornfield," Judge Blackwood said with icy disapproval, "the recordings of your strategic conversations with your client reveal that you constructed your case on deliberate exploitation of cultural stereotypes and ethnic prejudice. Your advice to emphasize Mrs. Gonzalez's accent and immigrant background as weaknesses represents a fundamental violation of professional ethics that I will be reporting to the State Bar Association." Patricia attempted to defend her actions, but the judge cut her off decisively. "The legal strategy you pursued was not merely incompetent, but actively discriminatory. You had a professional obligation to investigate the true facts of this case rather than building your argument on assumptions rooted in prejudice. Your failure to discover Mrs. Gonzalez's extensive qualifications represents either gross negligence or willful ignorance, neither of which is acceptable in this courtroom." Judge Blackwood's ruling on the asset division reflected his complete rejection of Richard's narrative and his recognition of Maria's true contributions to their shared wealth. Based on the evidence presented, particularly the documentation proving Mrs. Gonzalez's legal partnership status in multiple business entities and her expert contributions to commercial transactions, this court finds that she is entitled to 65% of all marital assets. The percentage was significantly higher than what Maria had originally requested, reflecting the judge's determination to account for both her hidden contributions and the attempted deception that had characterized Richard's case. The ruling included the family home, the majority of business holdings, and control of investment accounts that Richard had claimed as separate property. Furthermore, Judge Blackwood continued, the evidence of attempted asset concealment and fraudulent transfer to offshore accounts requires this court to impose additional sanctions. Mr. Castellanos will be responsible for all court costs and attorney fees for both parties, and I am ordering an immediate investigation into potential tax evasion and money laundering activities revealed by the financial evidence presented today. The impact on Richard's family was immediate and devastating. Eleanor Castellanos sat frozen in shock, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered as she realized that the woman she had dismissed and belittled for 12 years had just demonstrated intellectual and professional capabilities that exceeded those of her own son. The cruel comments about sending Maria back to Colombia had been revealed as not just prejudiced, but laughably ignorant, given Maria's superior educational background and international expertise. Diane and Marcus exchanged horrified glances as they comprehended the full scope of their misjudgment. The woman they had treated as an intellectually limited immigrant had just displayed legal knowledge and financial expertise that made their own professional accomplishments seem modest by comparison. Their whispered conversations about Maria's supposed inability to manage money had been exposed as embarrassingly ignorant assumptions based on ethnic stereotypes rather than factual assessment. As the courtroom began to empty, Richard remained seated in stunned silence, his entire worldview shattered beyond repair. The woman he had lived with for 12 years, the woman whose intelligence he had consistently dismissed and whose contributions he had systematically minimized, had just demonstrated that she was not only his intellectual equal, but his superior in multiple professional domains. Maria gathered her documents with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout her presentation, her movements calm and dignified despite the magnitude of her victory. She spoke briefly with Linda Rodriguez, who was still processing the revelation that her client possessed legal qualifications that exceeded her own, then walked toward the courtroom exit with the quiet confidence of someone who had achieved complete vindication. As Maria passed Richard's table, she paused for a moment and spoke to him in Spanish, her words carrying the weight of 12 years of suppressed intelligence and hidden capabilities. The translation, delivered in perfect English for the benefit of those still present, was devastatingly simple. I hope you have learned that underestimating people based on their accent or origin is always a mistake that carries consequences. 6 months after the divorce proceedings concluded, the full consequences of Judge Blackwood's ruling had become apparent throughout the city's business and social circles. Richard's reputation had been destroyed not just by the financial losses, but by the revelation of his character that had emerged during the trial. The recordings of his derogatory comments about immigrants and his strategies for exploiting cultural prejudices had circulated widely, making him a pariah among the professional networks where he had once held influence. Several business partnerships dissolved as associates distanced themselves from someone whose judgment and character had been so thoroughly exposed. Richard's construction company struggled to maintain contracts as clients questioned whether they could trust someone who had been revealed as systematically dishonest in his personal dealings. The man who had once moved through professional circles with supreme confidence now found doors closing and conversations ending when he approached. Patricia Thornfield faced professional discipline from the State Bar Association, with sanctions that included mandatory ethics training and public censure for her role in pursuing discriminatory legal strategies. Her law firm quietly suggested she might be happier pursuing opportunities elsewhere, and her career in family law effectively ended as word spread about her willingness to exploit cultural prejudices for tactical advantage. Maria used her settlement to establish the International Women's Legal Advocacy Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping immigrant women navigate the American legal system and protect their rights during divorce proceedings. The center provided free legal services, translation assistance, and educational programs designed to prevent other women from experiencing the kind of systematic discrimination and manipulation that Maria had endured. The center's first major success came when Maria herself testified before a congressional subcommittee on immigration and family law, her expertise in comparative legal systems making her a powerful advocate for reform. Her testimony, delivered in flawless English supplemented by citations in multiple languages, led to new federal guidelines prohibiting the use of accent or cultural background as factors in family court proceedings. Maria's academic credentials, now fully revealed, led to offers from 3 major universities to join their law faculties. She accepted a position as professor of international family law at a prestigious institution, where her unique combination of practical experience and scholarly expertise made her one of the most sought-after experts in her field. The final irony came 2 years after the divorce when Richard, struggling financially and professionally, applied for a position with an international development firm that required expertise in cross-border commercial law. The application was reviewed by Maria herself, who had been retained as a consultant due to her specialized knowledge in the field. Her professional recommendation, delivered with the same measured precision she had displayed in court, was that the applicant lacked the sophisticated understanding of international legal frameworks necessary for success in such a position. In her private practice, Maria became known throughout the legal community as someone who could see through deception and uncover hidden truths that others missed. Her reputation for meticulous preparation and brilliant analysis made her the attorney of choice for complex international cases, and her fees reflected her status as one of the most skilled practitioners in her field. The women who attended Maria's legal workshops at the Advocacy Center often commented on her ability to help them find their own voices and recognize their own worth, regardless of how others had characterized their capabilities. She taught them that intelligence and expertise came in many forms, that education and knowledge were not always immediately visible, and that patience and careful preparation could overcome even the most entrenched prejudice and discrimination. Maria's story became a case study in law schools across the country, used to teach future attorneys about the dangers of making assumptions based on cultural background and the importance of thorough investigation in family law cases. The recordings from her divorce trial were played in professional ethics courses as examples of how prejudice could corrupt legal strategy and destroy professional careers. In quiet moments, Maria sometimes reflected on the 12 years she had spent hiding her capabilities and allowing Richard to maintain his illusions of intellectual superiority. She realized now that her patience during those years had not been weakness but strategic preparation, building the foundation for a revelation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away when the right moment finally arrived. The lesson that echoed through legal circles long after the case concluded was simple but profound. Never underestimate someone based on their accent, their background, or their willingness to remain quietly observant while others reveal their true character through their words and actions. Intelligence and expertise are not always displayed openly, and those who mistake silence for ignorance often discover their error when it is far too late to change the consequences of their assumptions.